Come celebrate World Environment Day with us. The Climate Conscious Podcast and Black Earth Podcast are hosting a World Environment Day webinar, One with the Land, Restoring Earth, Transforming Ourselves. Join us on Wednesday, 5th June, as we explore global perspectives on land restoration for regeneration and resilience. See link in the show notes to register. We are Generation Restoration. Hello and welcome to the Climate Conscious Podcast. I'm Durval Bazi, and today I'm joined by my Caribbean podcast sister, the one and only Miss Dainalyn Swaby, the Global Yaadie. You're no stranger to the podcast, so welcome back to the Climate Conscious Podcast, Dainalyn.
Thank you, Durval. I was too busy smiling. Happy to be here.
Happy to have you. I am excited to delve into the different dimensions of Dainalyn, especially your journey as a climate change communicator. So I want to jump right in, Dainalyn. You and I connected back in December 2020. I don't know if you remember.
Yep.
So we were both new podcast hosts, and we connected over being from the Caribbean as well as our shared interest in climate action. And at the time you were in the UK, having just completed your master's through the Chevening Scholarship Program, waiting to return to Jamaica. And I must say, I am very grateful to walk alongside you as a fellow Caribbean climate podcaster. And I consider us pioneers in this space, and I'm very proud of our growth and our longevity. So 4+ years in, as the founder and host of the Global Yaadie Podcast, can you share your experience on this journey over the years, as well as the vision and mission of this platform that you have created?
Wow. Thanks, Durval. I mean, you recounting that experience, it took me right back to East London, where I was, pursuing that degree in global communication and development, now global communication and social change as they've adjusted. But I feel like I have to go a little bit back to how it all started, where, and I hope I'm not preempting the experience that I am here to share, but, right out of university, I was introduced or exposed to the world of climate communication through the kind of projects that I was supporting, working with climate and environment projects. I got my start when I always have to big up the JA Reach project. It's a long name, but the long and short of it is that it was a USAID funded project that really worked at several levels in Jamaica. So working with civil society groups, working with government agencies, youth groups, through different interventions that help people to respond to climate change. I feel like that's almost a textbook definition or description now, but it was really a good experience for me as a communicator, not just sitting behind the desk, but, being in the field, being in communities and different spaces and looking at climate change impacts, looking at climate change responses from all angles. And then, it dawned on me that in this space, in this work, for us, maybe as a communicator for myself, it might be a 9 to 5 in the context of what I did with the project. But the reality is that climate response, it's around the clock. And so I started being invited to different spaces to speak about the work that I do, to speak about the importance of climate change. And I guess then you would say I started to don the advocacy hat or robe. And then the pivotal moment or turning point came when I was about to go on a scholarship, and I also had applied for what was the first UN Youth Climate Summit. So that was my first experience being in an international setting with other young people who were passionate about climate change, more advanced. And of course, Durval, this was the era, or would I say the birth of the climate strikes. So there was a climate march in New York the Friday evening that I got there, joined them. And it was just amazing seeing the world up close from this perspective. Of course, as a Caribbean person, I was like, Never in the Caribbean. You know, you have young people out and striking and being taken seriously for that. But the flip side is that across this part of the world, they were being lauded for this kind of brave and bold confrontation and holding world leaders to account. Nonetheless, you know, swept up in the newness of the conference. But I also recognize that a lot of the focus was on the people, the youth, you know, who were leading climate strikes and the indigenous youth from the other countries. And while I saw some of my Caribbean counterparts, we were there in the minority. And I felt like this is good that we're here being involved, but we have to take center place, you know, because of what we are experiencing in the Caribbean. Jamaicans will tell you from 1988, Hurricane Gilbert, that has been a recurring theme. We'll never forget, you know, and we've seen in recent years, in the decades past or following this, the rapid succession, unfortunately, of natural disasters that have really impacted our Caribbean countries. So I'm saying all of this to say, it dawned on me that we can't just be in the back as Caribbean youth. You know, we need our own space. And when I had some discussions, you know, I had some stirrings in my mind before New York that really showed me that I need to stand in my own gap. I came from an advocacy group called Talk Up Youth. I used to be on radio in Jamaica on Saturdays, Talk Up Youth, you know, spearheaded by media personality Empress Golding that we speak of dearly. And, you know, I've always been drawn to spaces that will empower and to give voice. And I said, you know, given my advocacy experience with Talk Up Youth, given my natural talent as a speaker, having the gift of gab, and coupled with my professional vocation as a communication specialist, I said I have to bring all of this together. And you know, I carried it like, you know, a pregnant mother, if I may really use that analogy, to say I have to give birth to something. And that was how Global Yaadie was born, especially now that I was in an international space and that I had the opportunity to learn from, but I also had the opportunity to represent and to share my experiences. I had to make claim for the Jamaican space, for the Caribbean space. And that's how Global Yaadie came forth. Somebody gave me that name because I said, I'm a Jamaican interacting with so many people from across the world. And I want us to kind of build this bridge. And that's how Global Yaadie was born. Yaadie, that colloquial term given to a Jamaican living outside of Jamaica. So the mission has been exploring climate, culture, and connections. Because talking to anybody, regardless of which country or area they're from, if they're a climate expert, activist, or enthusiast, they have to touch on something that is culturally related. And we have to take, you know, that is how, outside of the scientific groundings of climate impacts and changes, culture is a critical part of that. And establishing a connection is a critical part of that as well. So I think, you know, that's the three things that I've been committed to. And the vision for Global Yaadie is, as its name suggests, to continue to connect with the world, to make climate conversation as culturally relevant as possible, so that we can spread awareness, so that we can spread appreciation, and so that we can encourage action in relation to climate change. A friend of mine says, agitate. And, you know, if we achieve that goal as well, I'd be very much grateful.
Wow.
I took you down there, did I?
No, thank you for that. It's amazing that the mixture of you being drawn to spaces that empower your natural talent, as you said, as a speaker, as well as your professional background as a communication specialist, all this came together to birth the Global Yaadie. And I've always admired that name, and I think it's so perfect for you and your platform. And that important mission of making climate conversations culturally relevant, which is so important. And you also mentioned, you know, being part of that Global Youth for Climate initiative and recognizing the Caribbean being a minority, taking initiative, taking action to change or to fill a gap that you recognize and experienced.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We can't say it enough, you know. I feel like if we remain silent, we're erasing our identity, we become less relevant. And so, you always have to be, putting that constant reminder and taking up space, as we always like to say. We always have to let our purpose, our presence be known, because that's how we can effect change and, really drive consideration for climate action.
The school strike for climate, I think that is a classic example of the nuance of culture. Because, like
Yes.
you said, something like that will not work in the Caribbean.
Yeah. You're right, because even during my studies too, and I really wish I love that you're making me go down memory lane, Derval. So I feel like I'm just gonna open up my school files and just, pour back into it. But there are even levels to climate activism. There is disruptive activism, there is dissentful activism, and there is dutiful activism. And sometimes it's really, I don't want to say play the game, but I feel like if you really want to achieve a particular outcome, you have to know what works for your context. And unfortunately, it's really unfair though, when youth agitate and stand up, you're sometimes perceived in a local space as troublemakers. You're seen as you wanting to upset the status quo. And so you feel like you want to stay within certain lines and stay within a box. But then I even reflect on the history and heritage of the Caribbean. And even, when we can consider our ancestors and forefathers and liberators of the different Caribbean countries, what if they had stayed within certain lines? So there is value to making people feel uncomfortable. And sometimes our leaders don't like that, but that is quite necessary. Although sometimes it's quite unfortunate that if you're supposed to use particular approaches to make your voice be heard, to express your position on a certain issue, this perception becomes a barrier to the goal that you're trying to achieve. So I think, what it then calls for is, strategy, and to see how you can persist and, at the same time, find ways to be collaborative, so that it can be met. But it's easier said than done. Trust me. Yeah. And I think you know all too well that reality as well.
Yes. And it's important that we challenge, but it's also important that we understand our local context. And as you said, develop strategies that have a chance at being effective.
Yeah. Amen to that.
Mm-hmm. So, Dainalyn, you wear many hats. You are a mentor, a speaker, a podcaster, creative writer, and this list is not exhaustive. But how do you balance all these roles, and what keeps you inspired and motivated to continue doing the work of raising awareness about climate change?
So part of it I alluded to, even though boy, sometimes Derval, I'm tired of the hats. Because as you also evolve, with age, your priorities change. And while some things will continue to be important, you have to take stock of how you go forward and sharpen your focus, hold the things that are dear to you. But sometimes you just really have to, I don't want to say put down certain things, but I guess you said it well, that keyword balance. So I think for me, I have many talents, and people see me nowadays, all they think, sometimes I laugh to myself, because the other day somebody called me and said, "Hey, your LinkedIn profile has not been updated forever, like the side panel." And I know that, since 2019, you've been doing amazing things. And I thought about updating it, and maybe I can't get into why not now, but I'm like, okay, the long and short of it is that probably no, a lot of people in relation to my social footprint or online social footprint, they know me as the Global Yaadie, but it's so much more than that. I loved performing arts. Not that I was like, like an expert or very a professional performer, but that's something I've always liked to do. And I could have gone a very different direction with my podcast. I didn't have to talk about climate change, but I felt like it was important to stand in the gap. I did not want to be a bystander. And from that word that I learned in my psychology class at UWI, the non-bystander or bystander non-intervention. When you have the people always talking about a problem and saying we need people to be, spreading information, promoting awareness, and you're not doing the very thing you're calling for. So I decided to take up the mantle in a space or in a corner where I felt like at the time, there were very little people. And as I said, when I think about the youth faction in climate change, because now we have to give space and reverence to the people who've come before us, especially in the feminist space, the people who've always been advocating and championing. But the youth movement for me, it wasn't as evolved in certainly at the start of my journey. I'm not saying it was non-existent, but I do know that it wasn't as evolved that it was now. So I felt like, I had a role to play, given this exposure. I feel like it was part of my responsibility. And let me tell you, what keeps me inspired to answer your question is that community and support. So I was blessed to find people like you, Derval, and to find people like Aisha Constable, Janelle Tomlinson, Eleanor Terrelong, who for me were the first set of youth leaders who I would want to say either welcomed or introduced or supported me in this space. And now we've done so well in growing and expanding that Caribbean community and also the international community. So part of it is the people who validate me, though I have my internal validation, and just every time, even outside of that network, just looking around and seeing what's happening, there's no way you can continue to not raise awareness when the stark realities of climate change, they have their own key to enter our homes, pushing past us through the front door. When you think about droughts, when you think about the floods, when you think about the extreme weather events and so forth. So, I just feel like all this phenomena has just, it keeps on poking me that, we need to continue this work.
Absolutely. One thing about a space is that it's always evolving, which makes it very exciting. The climate space, I see it as being intergenerational, and I believe each generation has to take up the battle and continue the race, continue the fight to bring about change that would lead to climate resilience and lead to sustainable development.
Yeah. As you said, intergenerational equity, and each generation has something different to offer. So we have similarities, but there is a difference because sometimes it could be a sense where just in the same way as an individual, you, just like me and you as podcasters, I'm sure you can relate that sometimes you had an idea to do something and you were overthinking it. And you have the wherewithal, maybe the experience, the skill set, the resources, but there's just something in the back of your mind or other factors that just have prevented you from just getting to where you need to. And along comes somebody else, not even giving a half more thought and does that very thing. And I broaden that to what it might be like, for an intergenerational comparison, where here comes another generation who, they don't give it a half thought. It's there to be done and they just do it. And we want that kind of situation because you're building on strengthening, and that's a part of, moving forward. Think about this like a moss, or no, maybe not moss, because they say like rolling stone gathers no moss, but think about a sort of natural wheel that picks up momentum. It gets bigger. It's moving with greater force as it goes along. And that's kind of how I perceive the climate movement, especially the youth-led, citizen-led climate movement as well.
Oh, yes, I can definitely say that the Caribbean climate movement has been building momentum. When I reflect on when I first really started to get active in this space and in the regional space, there wasn't as much activity as I see happening now.
Yes.
Maybe it was as a result indirectly of COVID-19 forcing everything to be online. Maybe it's a matter of greater access, but I do think that there is a lot more activity happening in the climate space and a lot more persons getting involved. It's no longer just for the policymaker or just for the scientist, but we're seeing a lot more collaboration, cross collaboration, and a lot more genuine interest in climate change as Caribbean people recognizing how we are impacted and also how we in turn contribute to resilience and sustainability. And similar to you, I think community and support and partnerships and networking, it allows us to really expand our reach and our impact. And that is definitely invaluable in doing this work because there's so much to be done and we can't do it as individuals. We can't do it all as individuals. So when we come together, we see greater impact, we see further reach of our messaging. And I think that is a beautiful thing. That's something I really appreciate about the Caribbean climate movement. The networks that we have been able to build, the alliances that we have been able to create, the outcomes of those collaborations.
Yeah, I mean, you speaking about the Caribbean reality, and it made me think about this. Don't ask me to sing it because I learned it in an off-key way. So, but there was a song, "No Man is an Island," and I mean, it's just so fitting as Caribbean nationals to embrace that as our mantra, and in all that we do. No man is an island, or no woman is an island, or no one stands alone. In the spirit of inclusivity to embrace that. So we are islands, different boats. You remember that? Different boats, same storm. So we still have to band together no matter how we look at it.
Yeah, and as you were speaking, I was thinking that regional integration is an ongoing work in the Caribbean, but I definitely see that level of integration, I would say, in the climate change space. So maybe that can be a model for other aspects of our development.
Absolutely.
So you've mentioned your work with youth, and I've seen your work also with rural women. And you touched on the need for climate change or climate conversations to be culturally relevant. So in your experience, how do climate change and culture intersect? How does culture influence how different communities perceive and respond to the climate crisis?
Wow, that's a very good question. People tend to say that when they don't have an answer. I'm just kidding. But I think it's very much it's very much intertwined, especially because, as you mentioned, culture has to do with, culture influences how, people perceive, people understand, how people respond to climate change, and climate impacts affect cultural practices. It affects people's traditions, it affects their identities. And whether you're looking at it from a country perspective or a community perspective, there's so many stark examples. I, for one, can pull out the fact that wherever I go, I talk about the fact that I am from St. Elizabeth, Jamaica, which is known as the breadbasket parish of Jamaica. And so because we're the third largest parish, but one of the largest food producing regions. So it's actually part of, not just from an economic standpoint, but from a cultural heritage standpoint, for decades, that we play a very significant role in driving the nation's food system. And so when you think about, couple that, or contrast that with climate impacts and what that means for agriculture and food security. If there is a strain on farmers and agricultural capacity to generate food, that affects the way of life, that affects things that people are used to. And even if I don't want to talk about it in such a technical way, I want to invite you and your listeners to step into the vortex that is your childhood memory. Think about it. Is any part of your childhood memory connected to the environment, connected to the outdoors, be it through a pastime or some sort of recurring activity? And if the answer is yes, then I think we have our explanation as to how culture and climate intersect. Because when you bring it down to the basic, or the very frank term of it being our way of life, and how climate change is altering our way of life, then you have your opposite, you have your answer there, to see how it's about how it is shaping how we live. So it's deeply intertwined. If you think about indigenous knowledge, indigenous communities, how they've been always been connected to the natural environment, the kind of reverence that they have, whether it is for some people religious and spiritual beliefs, even in the Caribbean, Derval, when we think about how there, I don't know in Trinidad if it's the same for you, but sometimes if it rains, the fact that we say showers of blessings, if it's drought, then it has another connotation to it. And so sometimes people may think or not think that it might be retribution. In previous times past, people used to worship sun god, rain god, all kind of things. And now, that has evolved. And a lot of our social norms and values, surround environmental ethics. It surrounds the principles of like collectivism or individualism. So that can also determine community-based responses to climate change. So you have different examples of some communities that may be stronger on the front lines of climate response and action because they have that close-knit energy from before. So it translates into their response. When, as a communicator, I also have to be mindful that when we think about culturally relevant approaches to how we spread information, the language and the messaging, we have to take that into consideration. So there's a lot of interconnection there. If media is a prominent part of a country's culture, and so a lot of people classify media as the secondary validator of climate information, science being the first. So media, as I also had studied, given the line of my degree, plays a pivotal role in shaping climate discourse. And so it can communicate the urgency around climate change. It can influence the public perception of climate change. It can spotlight leadership approaches as it relates to climate priorities. And also even the coming back to the principle of storytelling, how is it painted? Is it a scientific prerogative? Does it have to do with economics? As because some people do believe that climate is related to economics and then or health issues and so on. So it ranges. So there is so many layers to how we look at how climate and culture can intersect. If you look at societies globally, the Maasai along the African continent and other nomadic cultures, farming practices, it wasn't just a part of subsistence and for them to it's not just a part of subsistence, but it's a cultural cornerstone. And now we see with the increasing impacts of climate change, this disrupts traditional farming practices. There might be other cultural practices that are being disrupted. We see that temperatures at sea changing how fisher folk might how they may catch fish and fish stock. And this could be something that's dangerous. They have to go further out to sea, and that's an increased risk. So the availability of food, the availability of natural resources, raw material, all sorts of things. And I'm pulling on so many things, because I'm trying to paint like a very broad picture of how interconnected culture and climate is. When you think about cultural heritage sites, I think about Jamaica, I think about other countries of the world where if your natural monuments form or certain spaces form a very important part of your cultural experience. If you're located along the coast, if you're located in a geographically vulnerable space, then it also means that with the impacts of climate change and the increasing threats of climate change, then these sites can be at risk. Think about ancient civilizations and the ruins that people love to explore. That's another part of culture. So even if it's not way of life, from a heritage standpoint, these things are at risk. Biodiversity as well, that forms a huge part of some of the cultural identifier and footprint of places. So it's really far reaching. And I want to also touch on something that I learned recently. Tuvalu gaining global attention because they're one of the countries in the Pacific that are at risk. I think even you can relate, Derval, that I don't know if it was this COP or the COP before, where maybe the environment minister or one of the government leaders, made a very prominent showing by addressing the cop in, standing in water, with his pants rolled up, and what else can communicate the reality that sea level rise is an increasing threat. And they are actually creating a 3D model of themselves, Derval, because they're being prepared for the worst case scenario that in like less than a century, because of sea level rise, their islands, their chain of islands will be underwater. So they're putting themselves into the metaverse to preserve their culture or cultural memory, basically. So there's so many far-reaching consequences. There's so many examples and reality of how climate and culture intersect.
Yes, climate change intersects everything.
Mm-hmm.
And I believe understanding the intersection of climate and culture is critical to engaging people in climate action. People care most about what affects them. And
Yes.
climate change is affecting our way of life as Caribbean people, our livelihoods when we talk about agriculture, tourism, fishing, so our cultural and spiritual beliefs and the ties to our natural environment, as well as heritage and biodiversity, all these things are at risk.
Yes. Absolutely. So, and you touched on, something that even through my exposure, the centrality of the natural environment. And so one of the common themes in emphasizing the importance of climate action, or even, promoting awareness of climate change, is to really emphasize and focus on place-based attachment, because that's how we make meaning of why things are changing and how things are changing. Even more so, there was a time when people felt like for you to convey climate change, of course the science is behind it and we're informed by the science. But as you mentioned, if you're depending on the audience that you're engaging with, then you really have to frame it from their reality, frame it from their point of view, their point of interest, and what they can relate to. And a lot of us, because climate impacts happen on the ground, it's happening to our environment, and then everything else is, it flows from there. So it does make sense for us to think of place, because it happens in a place first, and then of course the impacts are all interconnected.
Yeah, we could show the graphs and we could talk about loss of sea ice. We can talk about the melting ice caps. But what does that mean for me as a farmer in the Caribbean or as a taxi driver in the Caribbean?
Mm.
So that really demonstrates the importance of platforms like Global Yaadie and the Climate Conscious podcast, where we
Mm.
can translate these technical terms, these
Yeah.
scientific concepts and terminologies, and really bring it home to how it translates, how this global phenomenon translates into localized impacts, and it
Yeah.
affects our lives and livelihoods. It affects our communities, our economies, and our natural environment.
Yeah, as you touched on that, I want to come back in real quick to say, as you mentioned, and I think it goes back to even what I mentioned about the mission and vision of Global Yaadie, exploring climate, culture, and connections, because through distilling and exploring a person's climate experience, you get an insight into culture. And it makes me think back to the previous season of Global Yaadie that was done in collaboration with the Young People for Action Against Climate Change, another Caribbean-based organization doing such great work. And they had a project, building a Caribbean coalition of oh my God, am I messing this up? Building a Caribbean Youth Climate Justice Coalition. And we explored through the podcast episodes the experiences of different groups. And I had the privilege of speaking with the president of the Kalinia, the Organization of Indigenous People in Suriname, who's from the Kalinia tribe, Sirito Alania. And I also spoke to a member of the Garifuna community, and Derval, they gave stark examples of how climate will in turn affect the culture, because I remember talking to Sirito and him sharing how because of one extreme weather event, there was a guest house in the community that a lot of people were employed to. And so after that storm, with the guest house being destroyed and not being renovated, people had to migrate from the community. So you saw that there was, an economic disruption and even the culture, because what of a place that is known to attract tourism, and even in the context of the Caribbean, tourism is our bread and butter, and we know all too well that almost all our sectors are climate sensitive. So, so when it alters the economic reality, it goes beyond that, because now you may have people not coming into a community. You may have people leaving a community, as was highlighted in the case of the Garifuna and youth, and even in my previous research during school, as it relates to, where are economic opportunities, young people are going to follow and pursue those, and that may take them outside of their communities, which also means that if there are certain challenges and problems in their communities, then the collective efficacy or the community-based response may be impacted if you have an absence of youth, absence of people who are problem solvers and who can make meaning and mobilize and generate resources to respond to our problem in an efficient way. So it's definitely, far-reaching, and I was grateful for that kind of exposure, because while I was giving platform for people to share their experiences, it was an exchange where we were learning and it was solidifying why we do what we do.
Yes. And climate-related displacement and even forced migration really disrupts communities and culture. So it's something that I think we need to pay more attention to, because it's already happening. It may not be in the media, mainstream media, but communities are already being disrupted due to climate impacts.
Yes, absolutely.
Especially our indigenous communities, who live even closer to the land and who also, as you said, have a lot to share with us that can support climate action and building climate resilience.
Yes, because if it is that climate change is affecting, their traditional practices and there's a disruption, what if they don't have the resilience to bounce back? And then, there's disruption, people have to leave. Who will be there to carry on those traditions and practices? What does it mean for, the generations that have carried it forward to that point? And then there is a threat to the continuity of their cultural practice.
Yeah. So coming back to youth, your dissertation focused on the lived experiences of Jamaican youth regarding climate change. Tell us some key findings and insights from your research.
Wow, I laugh are beaming rather brightly, because now Derwal is allowing me to dust off the dissertation that was like 4 years ago. But I'm happy that you've actually invited me to revisit some of this, because now I've been able to appreciate that while, as we all know, climate terms and things evolve, now I can identify certain things that came out of that research to say, I wasn't using climate justice at the point of the research, but some of the findings I know can pinpoint some of the new terms that have since developed. But it's important to note that with my research, I didn't take the quantitative approach. So it was interpretive, if you're talking about methodology and to use back those terms to show that I really went to school. But it was a qualitative study, because at the time there was a lot of conversation around youth, as the harbingers of hope and being on the front lines of change. But I wanted to understand, what were youth saying? How do young people perceive their own role in the climate fight? And that's what led me to look at an investigation of youth responses to climate change within the Jamaican context. And some of the findings, saying it now, it's like things that we all know, but for me, it gave me an opportunity to do a deep dive into how youth make meaning of climate change. And we found that they did that from their own surroundings. So I did mention place-based attachment. And I think, I extracted that word, especially doing my research, recognizing that it was one of the easiest ways in which people will, make how people relate to how climate change is affecting them, how they make sense of the evolution of the environment and what's happening. And of course, that findings also highlighted the importance of peer-to-peer engagement and how youth communicating with youth is one of the most impactful or effective forms of climate engagement. And of course, the network that we spoke about, how there is a large opportunity or strong opportunity for climate networks to build collective advocacy. So we said earlier that no man is an island, and you see that in the climate space, where instead of going alone, going together. And a lot of young people, especially now, so when I contrast what I found to know the climate, the youth climate landscape in the Caribbean has evolved, you see the power of networks, that it's gaining critical mass, and it's also it's defining more substantive roles for young people. And so even in my research, it looked at the socio-cultural dimensions of climate change. So even from a community standpoint, what are some of the things that influence how youth respond? We touched on some of that again, with the forced migration, the lack of economic and employment opportunities that will influence young people to leave communities. And so sometimes, they don't, even though the desire is there, they don't have the means to carry out, climate work or responses to climate change, because there are other pressing issues. Some of them, they simply want to live their lives. Some of them, their employment prospects, as I mentioned before, are just someplace else. And even in my research, we found that depending on the community, so I had the opportunity to be exposed to the contrast with rural youth and urban youth. And there were some inner city youth that were a part of my study. And they were saying, listen, in communities embroiled by crime and violence, and yes, though we have issues with water cutoff, we have garbage disposal issues and other environmental challenges, even if it's not climate related, nobody has time to spotlight these issues when a man just dead down the road, So there are a lot of things to grapple with. And that shows you that, challenges are not linear. And it substantiates why climate change is classified as a super wicked development challenge, because it's unfolding with everything else. And so there are different factors that can influence how young people are able to take up the mantle of climate action. And we have to recognize that there is privilege that is intertwined. So if a young person has time, that in and of itself is privilege. And if they have resources, and if they have the networks that can take them closer to resources to carry out a project and implement a project, that is also a privilege. Because I found in my interactions that a lot of youth mentioned that while they were aware of some of the challenges, while they may have the network, they were by no means close to any source or any resource so that they could do something about the challenge. And so you found that some of them were discouraged in a lot of contexts. And where they may have a different kind of community structure, where there might be certain groups where you have a citizens association or some other community club, sometimes you had political orientation and politics, playing a role as a barrier to youth engagement. So if it was the MP that will likely, be able to provide some sort of assistance or support, depending on the community and the tribal nature of politics, sadly, in some contexts, sometimes you had youth shying away from certain roles because they don't want to be branded a certain way, because to seek help from a member of parliament and to receive same help or said help would suggest that they're politically aligned. And while that may be in the case in some contexts, it wasn't in others. And so you had this kind of standoff approach, and in some cases you had a standoff approach as it relates to the intergenerational disparity. So the youth approach, as opposed to the more the more mature approach, sorry. So while that wasn't like a recurring factor in all communities, but that was a very interesting insight that emerged from my research. And when I mentioned about the climate justice connection, while I didn't use it in specific terminologies, it did stand out to me, of course, that the marginalization of deaf and disabled communities, because in my research, I did speak to organizations that catered to the differently abled community, and they mentioned the lack of involvement and inclusion of youth, because sometimes they are excluded from these processes because the resources, you need a translator. People can't afford to pay for a translator. And then, you feel like, oh, they're deaf. So while they can't hear, let's put it in writing. But then some of them are still, illiterate. So, they may not be sign language literate as well. So then, it spotlighted the lack of communication tools and resources that were inclusive and responsive to the needs of these people, in the differently able communities. So there are a lot of findings and a lot of interesting insights that came out, from this standpoint, and even from like a government perspective and private sector perspective. There was this the important point that was made about providing exposure for youth, for them to be represented in the international context and settings, because when you give young people certain opportunities and they're removed from their reality, they can see the importance of representation, the importance of ensuring that their country experiences are heard. And then it kind of, what would you say, the colloquial term encouragement strengthened labor is coming out, but it kind of solidifies why they should be in this space, and gives them real purpose, or enhances the purpose of what they do. And so the skill sets that young people possess and the potential that young people possess was also something that came out in that, because a lot of them were weary, Derval, of the tokenistic engagement. So they felt that while some were being given opportunities, it showed that in some contexts, it was a checkbox approach that was used, that was engaged to in engaging youth. And while that's not new, that's still something that's a recurring challenge in how young people feel like they aren't being taken seriously. And I have much to say in response to that, but I'm just gonna give an opportunity for you to come in, because I know I said a lot.
Thanks for sharing those insights, Dainalyn, from your research. One thing that stands out is climate change being a super wicked development challenge, and that is so true.
Mm-hmm.
And also the issue of climate justice, existing inequalities and inequities shown in the different experiences of rural versus urban youth, as well
Yes.
as the influence of community structures and politics, and the barriers to youth engagement, as well as youth tokenism, and also inclusion of the deaf and disabled communities, because they too experience climate change in a unique way.
Yes. You're right. And it was very interesting, even corresponding with the representative, and learning how sometimes culture sometimes can have a negative connotation, because there are maladaptive practices in certain communities, where I learned that sometimes already people are ostracized because of their disability. So mute and deaf people are sometimes teased in some of their spaces. So I had learned that in some cases where for conformity and acceptance, you may find that they perpetuate some certain maladaptive practices, so burning of garbage in some communities and so forth, because you're doing something that everybody else is doing because you want to conform. And so, that was something that we had to be mindful of. And even when I mentioned about the literacy level, and so you do have that in certain communities, deaf people are farmers, and they may have other roles. And so sometimes we're not very deliberate in how we try to engage and include them in other aspects so that they can make a contribution. And so it was very important for that perspective to come out. And I do think it's still a challenge in how we can really develop more inclusive approaches to ensuring that they have an opportunity to respond to climate change. They have an opportunity to be seen as part of the solution. You know, I'd see Jamaica has made a very important step. We've placed birth certificates in Braille. And somebody listening might say, what does that have to do with climate change? But I mean, it's an important step, because if it starts there, then we're seeing that we need to expand and have that trickle down of policies and practices that will now become second place, that we consider differently abled persons in the work that we do, and that they're as much as a contributor to us. So not because somebody can't speak. I mean, I've had 2 members of the differently able community, or 4, on the podcast last year, and one of them is a radio station manager, and he's blind. So it just goes to show that we really have to be more mindful in how we develop, and if we're all about integration and inclusivity, we have to make sure that we're about it across the board as well.
Yeah, for sure. Because if persons are excluded from regular social activities, then they would also be excluded from climate action.
Yeah, that's true. Another thing from the research that I may have alluded to, but I just felt like I wanted to highlight it, lest the opportunity slips from me. But there parts of the findings spotlighted. I went back to the peer influence, but when I contrast, like I said, doing the research and seeing the evolution of the youth climate landscape from the Caribbean, there has been real impactful change. And so the research did highlight that young people play an integral role in supporting institutional communication, or perhaps substituting that in terms of how they construct messaging and how they create opportunities for their peers. So it was really positioning them from a participator approach to say, youth are the game changers in climate communication and climate action. And so when you think about how before, putting them into this box, looking at tokenistic engagement doesn't do young people justice, because now when I think of how the movement has evolved and how there are so many NGOs that are youth-led, so many organizations, we can't look at it as just volunteer work anymore. These young people are running organizations. So the same skills that you receive from a quote unquote 9 to 5, these are the same skills that are being imparted and that are being developed for young people who are, oiling engines of change. When you think about project management, governance, operations, financial management, and the list goes on, it's very much on par with any other sector, whether public sector, third sector, or private sector. So I'm saying it all to say that we need to also evolve in our thinking, and just saying, oh, the youth over there. I always say, stop putting them at the kiddie table. We're all at the same table right now. We're all at the same table right now. And I think for me, doing my research was the starting point of substantiating my opinions on what I was believing on, because how the scholarly work goes. Derval, you know what it is, we know the reality, but you have to find it somewhere in academic writing that supports the viewpoint. So it was really good to have an opportunity to put that on paper and to advocate in a scholarly way that young people are more than ready, and they are the vanguards of change, whether you want to look at it from a volunteer approach or look at it in a very professional way, that we're heralding change.
Oh yes, youth are definitely taking up space and leading change in a meaningful and significant way, both regionally and globally, and I'm very happy to see that.
Mm-hmm.
The topic of youth involvement in climate change, I know that you attended 2 editions of the United Nations Conference of the Parties on Climate Change, COP 28 and 25. So tell us a bit about your experience at the both COPs and what you believe were the key takeaways from those conferences.
All right. So the first one, COP25, that was in Madrid, Spain, although it was really Chile's COP. Uh, again, I think it was running theme. I can't say it was my first international engagement because I mentioned the youth summit, but that was also an interesting experience, and also feeling like I was just the only one in the room. Although I'm sure that I had other colleagues there that were in other rooms, but certainly one of the main takeaways for me at the time was how important it was to share country experiences, because I was invited through the interdevelopment bank, sorry, the IDB, to engage in a youth forum and to connect with other, global youth as to the importance of climate action, what is being done at the local level. So a lot of this was, that informational exchange and network building. And so that was important for me, just broadening the perspectives and seeing the range of youth engagement and the levels to which young people were involved in driving climate awareness. Again, a lot of them, leading climate strikes and other initiatives. And I was able to connect with those young people too. Like my earlier podcast series, we were able to document that kind of experience. But I think because COP28 is fresher in my mind, and now I would have been a more seasoned advocate, seasoned communication professional. And as you mentioned, in wearing a lot of hats, I also attended COP not just as a climate advocate, but as a young farmer. So one of the other hats, being from a farming household in St. Elizabeth and also being a member of the Jamaican Network for Rural Women Producers. I was part of a gymnasium program through the World Farmers Organization. And also in my communication capacity, I do support the UN the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. So right now in my immediate space, it's a lot of focus on food security and sustainable agriculture and climate resilient agriculture. And so COP28 for me was a lot of focus around the agriculture landscape. One of the highlights for me from that conference was being able to present an opening statement at the Ministerial Roundtable on Agriculture Day, because agriculture, though very critical for food security, is also under scrutiny in terms of the contribution to greenhouse gas emissions. And so this also brings into sharp focus this constant debate between the global north and the global south. Because while of course we need to look at more sustainable agriculture practices, we have to always make sure that we're not shutting the door, and I don't know how, on the reality of the situation, that when we think about culture again, Derval, when we think about country experiences and context, we have small farmers who are livestock farmers. It's not enough to say, we need to find an alternative. We need to just switch to a plant-based diet, because even in that COP experience, I participated in workshops that were developing white papers on advancing positions on plant-based diets and how it is that we make agriculture sustainable. And I had to be one of the voices in those rooms, saying that it can't be this way. In the spirit of inclusivity, we have to really consider, how do we make change how do we effect change without leaving people behind? So the takeaways for me was that, we have to continue to be in these spaces to ensure that the change that we talk about do really reflect the just transition. So it's not just, no pun intended, about the just transition in the energy sector. It's really about in other aspects of climate action and around other sustainable development goals. So that was a huge highlight for me. Another takeaway, and I think we spend all the time in this episode talking about youth evolution and youth change. So obviously it's one of the most the most impactful or impressionable themes. But for when I compare my COP25 experience and seeing the limited Caribbean representation. Fast forward to COP25, sorry, COP28, I think there was an increase. Obviously not where we want to see it, but I was very heartened by the level of engagement that I've seen, the representation around the youth delegations and country delegations, for young people given an opportunity to lead on their sessions and so forth. So that was amazing. And I also want to acknowledge and highlight the momentum that the Caribbean is still trying to build, using COP as an opportunity to launch a lot of initiatives, in relation to green energy transition and so on, so that we can get buy-in from maybe our global North colleagues, and also strengthen the voice on the small island developing country stage. I know a lot of people, we've waxed poetic about loss and damage and the huge win. And we put that in air quotes as well, because we're still in the wait and see mode. So I also think that the conversation has evolved. And sometimes people will ask, does COP make sense? Are we seeing the change that we need to see? What difference is it making? But we are recognizing that progress comes from pushing, and progress comes from opening the door again, walking through, using and opening up the same case of problems that we've been airing until we feel as if change is really happening. And so I'm just saying it for persons who often question and critique to not be disheartened. We just have to continue to push and press for progress. And I think my experiences at COP25 and now, contrasting it with COP28, we're really seeing that these things are never overnight. There's a whole lot of question, as usual, that surrounds COP presidency and how it is that it flows. But I also took away from that December experience in Dubai at COP28 that you really have to surround yourself with the people who are making change on the ground. So the civil society networks, the NGOs, and the like-minded individuals that you can connect with and to effect change. Focus on those connections, because they are the ones that also preserve the integrity of the effort. They are the people who are impacting others in communities, in other spaces, and really moving the needle in the way that matters.
Yes, we have to continue to push and press. And I'm very happy to know that there has been continual growth in the level of representation of Caribbean people, including Caribbean youth, at these climate change decision-making spaces. I think it's very important for us to be in the room and to be at the table and to contribute to discussions and decisions where decisions are being taken that affect us directly.
Yes, I want to make a sharper point. It's like me writing an exam and now getting the word out. So one of the other things, the best way to also put it, Derval, in comparing COP25 and COP28, where it's no longer an invitation to just share country experiences. One of the things that I also saw at COP28, where the role and how we show up as Caribbean youth has also evolved, where we're not just participants only, we're leaders and we're mobilizers of change. And that was evident by the a lot of fora that were coordinated by Caribbean climate youth. I think about even Girls Care, that the climate mentorship organization, and how they were able to coordinate an event that pulled on participation from young people from Asia and the Pacific countries and Africa to display that Caribbean climate model of mentorship, and so that was important. I saw young people who were giving presentations. Nicholas Key, who was a guest on my podcast for this season, seaweed farmer from Jamaica and co-founder of Key Farms, and he was making presentations and doing the rounds at COP, looking at how to secure climate finance for blue economy projects of scale in the Caribbean. So it's also a bit more technical in some contexts. It's more high level, and we're happy for that, because like I said, it's no longer an invitation to share experiences, even though we're doing that. but we have more pronounced roles, young people working and representing through the Commonwealth Secretariat. So having an opportunity to sit at tables with global audiences, myself as well. So not just with the ministerial roundtable, because that roundtable was with different ministers of agriculture across the world and leading on panel conversations, getting the opportunity to organize activities so that we can tap into the global space and have deeper conversations and workings around problem solving around climate action. So that was, very beautiful and encouraging to see. Not just receivers of information, but we were co-developing solutions in a lot of the spaces that we occupied at COP28.
I love that, co-developing solutions. And as a region, we do have a lot to offer in terms of not only our experiences, but also homegrown solutions and indigenous knowledge and practices.
Absolutely. We always anxious to share it with the world. So really, really, really proud of that. And like you said, it also builds momentum. I remember, I recall the Ashley Lashley Foundation as well, one of the youth movements that I really see doing impressive work in the region. They use that opportunity to build momentum for the Global Youth SIDS conference that's happening alongside the 4th International Conference on Small Island Developing States. So like I said, everything is pouring into one, and we're grateful to see how it's unfolding.
Yes. So what advice would you give to young professionals and students who are passionate about climate change and want to make a difference through communication and advocacy?
Interesting. So I could break that question into two parts, because before you ended with the communication and advocacy, I thought you're gonna stop at students passionate about climate change. So I was gonna say at first, start with where you are. And because of how interconnected climate change is intersectional. There is an opportunity to advance climate knowledge and advocacy through any kind of work that you do. So if you're a photographer, there is photojournalism that you can bring the impacts, share your lens, literally. If you're a podcaster like myself and like Derval, then it's self-explanatory, you know what to do. And I say that because sometimes we want to show people that it doesn't have to be one or the other. You can stay from where you are and make a difference through your vocation. So I think it's all about exploring the connection between your interest, your career pursuit, and how this ties with communication and advocacy. So you don't have to be a communicator to harness the tool of communication. You can do where you are. So if you're a chef, if you're passionate about agriculture and food, then there's a space for that through food and nutrition security, food loss and waste, and the list goes on. If you're an artist, you can use your creative juices and to spotlight, whether through visual depiction or otherwise, issues in relation to climate change. If it's a performing arts, there is a way to bring that across. I'm watching films and it's making it more obvious, how climate impacts on global warming, it's altering our way of life and what we need to do. Just last week, I was rewatching Aquaman Derval, and people always say the future is in film, and the themes are no longer subtle. It's direct. So I'm saying there's opportunity as a filmmaker to play on that, and so it comes back to, as I said, using that intersection with where your interests relate, because climate change is everywhere. If it's tourism, if it's mining, if it's whatever sector, I'm just pulling on certain local sectors in Jamaica and also in the Caribbean, there's an opportunity for you to just speak about, share the story of your work and how it relates. And if you feel like you don't want to do that, then there is always the opportunity for you to join a network, join a group, join a movement, follow Global Yaadie, follow Climate Conscious, confront, challenge, support us. And, those are opportunities, that you can continue to ensure that the message should look like how to frame the message, how to channel the message in spaces that need to hear it, in spaces that can convert the message into something stronger, like action on the ground.
Yes. Confront, challenge, and support us.
Yes. Because some people have strong opinions and are like, oh, I don't agree with what you said. Maybe you should be doing this. So tell us. So that is how they can also support and make this better. I'm actually thinking about how I can expand the team for Global Yaadie. I do have support, but looking at how we can tap into, more youth opportunities. And I would love an assistant producer to help me to frame and to reframe and to change the scope of what we're doing over here.
Yes. So what's next for Global Yaadie and even your professional career in the field of communication and development?
All right. So gone out on a limb, Durval, and have started the YouTube channel for Global Yaadie. That is a challenge, but that's what strong women do. We look challenges in the eyes and give it a wink. So I am trying to build out the YouTube platform. A lot, trust me, a lot to consider because it's quite a different logistic undertaking and consideration than setting up audio. So that currently has me exercising my creative muscle, and of course my muscle of resolve. So certainly there. Climate communication and development, I continue to give support to a lot of, well, I don't want to say a lot of, but projects and initiatives, both in a professional and volunteer capacity, that's looking at building regional resilience. So through ecosystem restoration initiatives, I'm able to still provide support. I'm able to get exposure, through different Caribbean contexts and realities. I think already I've expanded my travel and exposure to maybe 6 Caribbean countries. And I'm grateful for that because it puts me squarely in the nexus that I love, or the intersection that I love of climate, culture, and communications, looking at how the region is different but the same, and how we can benefit from, continuing to exchange our experiences, exchange best practices to advance regional resilience. So that's one aspect. And I also want to, maybe putting it out there will hold me to account, Durval, looking at how I can also channel my communication skill set. So I'm working on maybe developing some training initiatives as it relates to communication / podcasting. That's in its infancy, so I don't want to get into too much detail. But outside of the communication element, though, I do support other projects on the ground. So through my Rotaract Club and through my individual volunteerism, I've been able to support several communities in receiving grants to further an agricultural program in one high school, setting up an hydroponic system. And I've also launched a climate creative project with my alma mater, my primary school in St. Elizabeth, that's Black River Primary. So we'll be launching a climate creative initiative for the school, engaging with the students, and that will also result in a setup of a school garden, like an interpretive school garden. So we're in the process of seeking support. So if anybody is listening, we want to, of course, introduce agriculture innovations to the students, and also interpretive science, so they can understand if it's even planting a particular vegetable or fruit or tree, and why is it more climate resilient, so they know something, because we can't be in the breadbasket parish and not try to secure the future of agriculture through young people, through engaging with children. So that's one of the initiatives that I'm particularly excited about, and I'm happy for the support that I've been given thus far through to the teachers and the student population. So throughout the year, we're gonna hope to build out that project and see where it goes from there.
Well, I'm so happy that we had this opportunity to gain some more insight into the powerhouse that is Dainalyn Swaby, and to learn about your career as a climate communicator, and also helping us to understand the intersection of climate and culture in the Caribbean. So, as we conclude today's episode, which might be a two-part episode,
I don't mind. Derval, you know what you get when you have me on the podcast.
in your view, what would make the world a better place?
the first thing on my lips is communication. And people were like, that's so cliche. But trust me, think about it in every context and setting. Communication would make the world a better place. And when I say communication, I'm talking about the communication that, as I love to say, it builds awareness, it builds appreciation, and then it influences action. We've gotten it right in some contexts, but still. So it's a communication that dismantles cultural barriers. It's a communication that creates catalyst for collective action and, expands on collective consciousness. It's a communication that allows us to put differences aside, worldviews aside, and to understand that while we may be here for a time, in 100 years from now and so on, maybe people might forget our names or something, but we can leave something behind so that the future generations would know that we did care and we were not sleeping, while we recognize that we ourselves had destroyed the world. So communication to create a full circle moment to really advance sustainable development.
Well said, Dainalyn.
It felt a little cheesy, but I'm really hoping that it fell on me, that it's received with the best of intention.
I feel like everyone feels like their response to this question is cheesy, but I always get such profound responses. So yeah.
That's stretching me.
So how can listeners connect with you?
All right. Thanks for that. So you can follow Global Yaadie. So it's YAADIE. So Global Yaadie, we are available, I'd like to say, on the major podcast listening platforms: Spotify, Google, Apple, Castbox, and through our websites at globalyaadie.com. On social media, we're on all socials. So Instagram, I think that's our main space right now. We hang out a lot over Instagram, Twitter, or X, as they love to say, LinkedIn, Facebook. But definitely please subscribe to our YouTube channel as well, Global Yaadie. And I have to make a quick plug, Derval, to not just like, but just, subscribe and ensure that you follow, so that the algorithms, they're kind of funny these days, that they'll, continue to have us pop up so that we can connect with our global family wherever you are.
Yes, and go leave us a review on your favorite podcast app.
Yes, please.
Well, thank you so much, Dainalyn, for joining me today on the Climate Conscious podcast. I really enjoyed catching up with you, as well as your reflections on your journey. I know you have a lot more to offer, but you have already done so much, and I'm very proud of your accomplishments. I must say thank you for your commitment to sustainable development, but more so climate action in the Caribbean.
Thank you so much, Derval, and really thank you for opening up your platform. I think it's a first experience I've had through a podcast to be able to distill my experiences in the way that I have, and to just even highlight and showcase the other dimensions of my work. So I'm really thankful that you're able to open up that space for me, because I'm always the one asking the questions. So I'm grateful to be able to answer the questions this time around.
Yes, unpacking the many dimensions of Dainalyn Swaby.
Is that the episode title? That's lovely.
Thanks for tuning in to the Climate Conscious podcast. We hope you found today's episode interesting, informative, and inspiring. Visit theclimateconscious.com for more info. I'm Derval Bazi, and this is the Climate Conscious podcast.